Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Margaret, for organizing this very interesting workshop and having me here. Secondly, for a bit of context, my PhD questions the role played by the Belgian and French mayoralty under the German occupation at the Western Front during the First World War. A core theme in my dissertation is the question of food politics, the provisioning of the local population and the role that the mayoralty played herein. In this presentation, I will develop only one aspect of my dissertation, the relation between the local population and the Belgian and French mayors against the background of these food politics. In 1935, the Northern French author and later Prix Goncourt winner Maxence van der Meersch published his novel Invasion 14 or Invasion 14. Although literary scientists and historians describe it today as fictional truth, to date van der Meersch is praised for his nuanced assessment and credible representation of issues such as resistance, collaboration, denunciation, smuggling and profiteering in the occupied North during World War I. In the novel, van der Meersch convincingly narrates about life under German occupation in the Roubaix, Tourcoing and Lille urban area and its hinterland. What struck me the most was the way in which he portrays the mayor of the village, a small village close to this urban agglomeration. The mayor is called Hector Lacombe. The way he writes, what immediately catches the eye, and then especially for me, is the way in which he writes about Lacombe's role in the organization of provisioning and of the organizing of the food committee. The verdict is actually very harsh. Abuse of power, favoritism, withholding supplies, and even selling to German soldiers of rationed food intended for the population. Van der Meersch's choice to present the mayor in this way is really not in line with historiography on the subject. Most of these works today picture mayors as the last representatives of Belgian and French state authority who did what they could to protect the local population. Actually, mayors today are mostly seen as important examples of passive resistance and beacons of patriotism in the occupied territories. At the same time, research into the deficient and problematic food supply in the occupied territories is on the rise for last years. For a long time, historians exclusively concentrated on the international aid operations set up to save the Belgian and Northern French citizens from imminent starvation. Very famous is the later American president Edgar J. Hoover. Herbert Hoover. No, I'm always mixing the two, sorry. The one is from the FBI and the other one is the American president. In that research tradition, the local population was mainly described as passive receivers of food and aid. It was only most recent that historians started to get interested in the social tensions and political problems that food scarcity generated. And one source of inspiration for these new approaches in working on the occupation were the seminal studies that focused on the strained relations, social unrest and food protests in the European capital cities of Berlin, London, Paris and Vienna. These publications, as you can see over there, study the relationship between the state and the local population during the war, in sum. What I want to do is, in the wake of Maxence van der Meersch's portrait of Mayor Lacombe, I will try to elaborate two arguments in this presentation. First and foremost, I will argue that van der Meersch's explicitly negative perception is a result of the complex position of mayors and local governments in food politics, something that is, until today, I think, understudied. And secondly, I will demonstrate that the political legitimacy of mayors was not only defined according to their relationship with the occupier, because as you can see at the top, on the right of the slide, that is a typical image of a mayor during the war, is he negotiating with the occupier. But also, next to other problems, of course, is, I think, important for the legitimacy, is the relationship with the local population against the background of the food problem. A bit of context. The German occupation of Belgium and Northern France caused what I call a relocalization of daily and political life. During and after the invasion in 1914, central state authority in Belgium sort of collapsed. The king followed the army behind the trenches. The government went into exile, the ministries were closed, and prefects and provincial governors, also in France, retreated from function. Belgium was almost completely occupied, and northern France got cut off from the non-occupied capital Paris and the largest part of the country. The only Belgian and French authority that remained in office was local government. This was something also according to international law. The Convention of Den Haag stated that local authorities had to stay in place. So mayors were largely left to their own devices in the occupied territories, had to fall back on themselves and take over certain central state affairs, such as, for example, printing money was something local authorities spontaneously had to do and were confronted with. Another important aspect were food politics. An international trade embargo, a military invasion during harvest season, the restricted mobility of the population and the massive requisitions of the German administration resulted in food supply soon becoming top of the local political agenda in the occupied territories of Belgium and France. This specific context broke down regional, national, and of course international food markets, as well as trade and commerce. All of this led to a return of what the French historian Nicolas Bourguignat called le maire nourricier, or in English, the mayor as a feeder of his local population. This becomes very visible here. You see Ville de Fourmi, ravitaillement municipal. That implies, or that wants to say, that city of Fourmi in northern France is the city organization of food. You can see the mayor here in front with his closest collaborators and the helpers behind him. It will take until the end of 1914, spring 1915, for this first situation of food crisis in the occupied territories to more or less stabilize. Of great importance was the organization, as I've already mentioned, of international aid initiatives under the impulse of the Commission for Relief in Belgium. The Commission for Relief in Belgium is the organization under the leadership of Hoover. In Belgium and France, this led as well to the creation of the National Committee for Aid and Food and the Committee for Food in Northern France, two national organizations that are a bit dependent of the Commission for Relief in Belgium. They distributed the food that was imported by the Commission for Relief in Belgium. The implementation of these international aid operations involved the curtailment of the mayor's local autonomy of the first weeks and months of the war. From then on, mayors lost responsibilities to the committee, as the international initiatives absorbed and improved the already existing initiatives. They imported food and proclaimed most regulation. And notwithstanding this decrease in responsibilities, mayors continued to play an important role in organizing some supplementary initiatives, practical day-to-day organization, and because there was a large overlap in staff. The fact that Van der Meers's portrait of this mayor is not explained at all in the historiography on the subject is a direct result of the national framework that is ever dominant when we study local elites and administrations under military occupation. For quite some time, historians saw the occupation only as a conflict between Belgian and French, or on the one hand, Belgian and French on the one hand, and Germans on the other. From this perspective, these historians mostly focused on complex forms of resistance, collaboration, accommodation, and everything in between to understand the difficult position and political legitimacy of local authorities under occupation. This point of view, I think, results in intra-Belgian and French tensions remaining underexposed or not being discussed at all. The changing position of the mayor as a maire nourricier, or as a feeder of his population, and his visible role in food politics implies that food politics and the local population should be considered important as well for a better understanding of political legitimacy of the mayors and the state more in general. I think, as Maureen Healy and Belinda Davis and other researchers have so beautifully showed for the Vienna and Berlin case. Although we cannot speak of a typical home front for the occupied areas, the civilian population gave meaning to a proper occupied war effort in its own way. As such, they considered it their duty to endure the difficult conditions of the occupation. But civilians only were prepared to do so if everybody did this on an equal base. As such, there was an enhanced preoccupation with justice and fairness in food politics. These social relations were translated in the development of what the Irish historian John Horne described as a language of social justice. People who broke the rules, written or unwritten, took the risk of being blamed. Actions were aimed mostly at suspect traders, farmers and profiteers who made use of the difficult situation to enrich themselves. Against this background, the local population did not only expect from the state, or the mayoralty in this case, to find a solution for the ever-worsening living conditions, but also that it would do anything to keep the civilian population's sacrifices in proportion and balance. If city councils and local authorities did not succeed in doing so, the population made it clear to them that they expected more efforts. Such bottom-up interactions occurred all over the occupied territories at the Western Front, but had divergent objectives and might differ according to form, content, and execution. Most complaints from below related to badly organized provisioning. The population caused a stir and called for improvement. This frequently resulted in fierce discussions during official gatherings of municipal council and food committees. In Houdin-Emery, for example, you can see the local municipality on your right, close to La Louvière in the very industrial Hainaut province, reproaches were directed at the mayor, who you can see in the middle, who's standing in the middle, Charles Pardans. The occupier had decided to stop various food deliveries after Pardans, the mayor, had flouted the obtained warning to submit the correct documents in time. As a result, the members of the municipal council worried that there would be another revolt, they say. One member of the local city council even testified that hunger demonstrations already had occurred in front of the mayor's house by an agitated group of women. The mayor had great difficulties in calming down the crowd because he said, and now I come to the title of my presentation, the crowd isn't reasonably when it's hungry. He wasn't able to explain what happened, what went wrong, because they were starving. So just as in earlier times, hunger marches mostly ended in front of town hall, as already explained here yesterday. They were organized by women mostly and occurred most often in urban context or highly industrial areas. In the port city of Antwerp, for example, hunger marches occurred several times. One of the first marches took place in September 1916. A group of 15 to 600 laborers' wives made it clear to the mayor, Jan de Vos, who you can see here on your left, the old man, that the destitute population needed more bread and potatoes. Several months later, another women's demonstration took place on the central square in front of the town hall. This time, the woman cried out for bread and coal. After the police had initially ended the demonstration, the group of women, who were by then reinforced by a crowd of soup eaters, decided to carry on towards the mayor's personal house. A few days before the social protests, demonstrators had already passed an ironic poster on the man's door stating, "Bacon and lard can be found over here." It took several German soldiers to restore order and disperse the crowd. The demonstrators' plan to smash everything in the town hall to smithereens was cancelled. So, hunger marches were no exclusively Belgian phenomenon. Also in France, in the industrial commune of Fresnoy-le-Grand, in the Aisne department, not far away from the front, for example, about 200 women gathered at the central square claiming more action of the local authorities. This occurred elsewhere in other northern French towns as well, such as Lille-Roubaix again and Tourcoing, the highly industrial cities. Next to these crowd gatherings and manifestations, the local population used other means as well. In Cambrai, for example, in France, the population ostentatiously threw their distributed meals on the ground in the sight of the local councillors who were inspecting the distributions. As such, they wanted to protest against the poor quality of the food. Another way, and most common way, to make clear one's grievances is writing letters, both individually and collectively. In Antwerp again, one woman wrote to the mayor, Jan de Vos, in the summer of 1915 already to reinforce her argument. She included a bit of fish in the envelope. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Mayor, a sample of the food which I collected in branch of Italia this morning. The smell will warn you, Mr. Mayor, sufficiently about how the food committee mocks your population. Once again, dear Burgomaster, I insist on your benevolent intervention to safeguard the population against diseases." The local population also blamed its representatives for not or barely succeeding in ensuring that everybody had more or less equal access to food. When this was the case, they questioned local councils and food committees to take on a tougher stance against usurers, profiteers, and hoarders. Several letter writers openly wondered why it was not possible to just simply confiscate food supplies from wholesalers, retailers, and profiteers, and then make them available to the population. One letter to the mayor of Lille stated, "If you want to, sir, it would certainly be possible to have more bread each day. You just have to requisition the flour and wheat that is being held by the merchants, because there were never more merchants as today. All the products gathered by the merchants would certainly improve our situation." These sort of bottom-up complaints are clear examples of what Jay Winter and Jean-Louis Robert described as social relations of sacrifice in their seminal work on Berlin, London, and Paris. The unambiguous message from a group of women, of French soldiers, to the Lille mayor Charles Delsalle summarizes this most aptly. They write, "You have to believe that the profiteers and retailers are making profit, but we can't even afford to pay our daily bread. Why this difference? And think this is important now." They write, "Aren't we all Frenchmen? And don't we all have to suffer in the same way?" For the Belgian and French mayoralty, combating profiteering proved to be an extremely difficult matter. Due to the occupier and its police forces, they lost most of their mechanisms to maintain order. The German occupier played a very ambiguous role in all this. At certain moments, it feared social unrest behind the front, what made them proclaim lower food prices and punish retailers who ignored imposed prices. But at other times, they deliberately opposed and prevented severe repression when Belgian and French authorities wanted to act more harshly against profiteering wholesalers who were working for the occupier. This arduous struggle against profiteering, fraud, and the poor results it generated led to certain popular perceptions on local authorities. Particularly in the last year of the occupation, mayors were increasingly getting considered as complicit and co-responsible for fraud, profiteering, hunger, and even scarcity. Some civilians stated that those who were in charge of food politics were doing this out of pure self-interest and for personal gain and not for the common gain. Again in Lille, at the end of 1918, so in the last year of the war, a group of citizens wrote to the mayor in anger, "How is it possible that the rich and the members of the committee always have enough? How is it permitted to see all these chiefs of the committee that fat and thick? No doubt that they have a good meal right under our nose and beard with the best products that arrive in Lille for the rest of the population." That last year, reproaches concerning political patronage, favoritism, personal enrichment were never far away in the occupied territories. Again in France, in Tourcoing, around November 16 already, some anonymous handwritten posters in food distribution locals accused the, in normal times, very popular mayor Gustave Dron of fraud and favoritism, as he would allegedly have gave larger rations to his friends and co-workers. To what degree such accusations were justified is difficult to ascertain. This proved to be the case of the De Brabander affair in Roubaix as well. In May 1917, rumors were arrived that the socialist deputy mayor De Brabander had attempted to enrich himself at the expense of the committee and therefore also of the population. Investigations by the local police showed that the rumors were unfounded, but a direct result of the affair was that it discredited the local authorities as well as the food committee. Even evacuated refugees in Free France, a half year later, kept talking of this when they arrived in Annecy and Evian a few months later. One of them explained that the people displayed posters on city walls openly accusing De Brabander and his followers. Such reproaches and popular opinions on mayors were heard in both countries, but were far less frequent in occupied Belgium. One reason is that food difficulties were more grave in northern France, but that would be a too easy explanation, because interesting as well is that some examples show that in Belgium anger and frustration was formulated in other words. One such an example is the publication of an anonymous booklet that describes some mayors as vampires de guerre, as war vampires. The publication complains of the ambiguous attitude of several rural mayors on the food issue. Center stage in this discourse is the conflict of interest between a mayor who had to requisition food supplies from the farmers and the mayor who was himself a farmer and therefore had every interest in withholding food, because in the rural countryside in Flanders and in Belgium, mayors were mostly the most richest farmer of the village. That was, for electoral reasons, it was very easy for a large farmer with a lot of ground to get elected as mayor. In the most extreme cases, they would even sell it at exorbitant prices to those who could still pay for it in the cities. This illustrates that tensions between the cities and the countryside were far more grave in Belgium than in France, where the link between, in France then, the link between city and countryside was non-existent due to the German occupation that was much more local and much more harsh. In Belgium, other mayors in the countryside were targeted by city dwellers and suspected, while in France, people reproached one's own mayor. So that was an important difference. And now I come to my conclusion. What can we conclude? I think two things. First of all, the functioning of the mayor as a feeder of the population clearly reappeared in the occupied territories. One can even ask if this paternalistic and political function of the mayor as a feeder even ever disappeared at all as a consequence of this nationalization process of the food market and the national state. Perhaps this nationalization process was more of a macroeconomic reality than a political one. Or perhaps this specific role of a feeder only appears during times of crisis, which were almost absent between 1870 and 1914. Secondly, in the final year of the occupation, the suspicions of fraud and self-serving were far more directly aimed at the local authorities in northern France. One particular explanation was that the famine was more acute there, this due to the position of the front, the specific socio-economic context, and the much more extensive military presence. Nonetheless, and this asks for more research, state authority and legitimacy never collapsed, not in France, and not in occupied France, and not in occupied Belgium, but it happened in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or in Germany, due to food scarcity and the implosion of the home front. I think it was impossible in the occupied territories that the home front collapsed. Ironically enough, I think, because of the presence of the German occupier. Also, the relation between the population and the state in the occupied territories, I have shown, was under serious strain. And there were a lot of tensions, but they always kept interacting, which is, for me, one of the proof that legitimacy remained okay in the occupied territories, because they kept interacting. They never went to the German occupier as some new sort of authority or an alternative source of authority. They kept interacting, so legitimacy didn't collapse as elsewhere it did. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. That really resembles much of about the hunger marches was Anna told yesterday. Though I think there is one question which Anna mentioned, that the women marches were discredited by the local authorities. Did you find anything like that in your...
I don't think they discredited them. They saw women, and especially civilians, and especially women, as not as a political threat, not at all, but they took grievances serious. They didn't publicly recognize it as serious, but when you look at city council deliberations, the weeks thereafter, there were always discussions. And for me, it's one reason to think or to be convinced that we should and that is something that is seen in the work of Maureen Healy, for example, as well. She considers civilians as well as political actors. And if they want to get something on the local political agenda, they make it. They they tried, and the results were okay. There was not much they can do, but the result was that it was on the local political agenda, and that was what they were striving for. So I think it was quite effective in a certain way.
So can I just ask a follow-up from that? Do you think that the reason that it is women that are demonstrating is because of the household division, i.e. that this is women who have charge of food? Or is there also an element of this is, in some senses, easier for women to protest than other elements of the occupied population in terms of what they might bring back on themselves?
I think it's both factors, what you say, but I think there's even a third factor which is also very important in the context of the occupation. That was conscription. There weren't a lot of men in the occupied territories. So I think the three factors combined explain, I think, why it were the women who protested. But one thing that is important as well, I think, is that when these women protested it, they framed it as mothers who wanted to feed their children. And I got convinced that this is one of the most powerful arguments one can give. And for a mayor, it is impossible to disagree on that, because they have to feed their children. So it's a very powerful argument that they try to negotiate it with the local authorities.
Another question, a comment. You said that lady, she sent a piece of fish
Mm-hmm.
to the mayor. I forgot to mention yesterday that a Swedish woman brought pig fodder bread to the mayor and made him eat it.
Yeah.
Because they had to make bread out of pig fodder. And so it was a way to say, try it.
You see it also in the occupied territories. When there are hunger marches, they complain the quality of the food, and they bring the food, the special war bread, the K-bread, the Kriegsbrot, that is made on instructions who are given by the occupier. It's the occupier that decides what should be in the bread and not. And they go complaining at local authorities, but in fact there's not so much that they can do, because it was the occupier who ordered it, of course. So politically it was a very complex situation for these local authorities.
Yeah. Thanks, yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I was really struck by what you said at the end about how important the interactions were with local people, and that the mayors kept doing that rather than just going to the occupiers to sort this thing out. Did the mayors talk to one another about how they might deal with these issues? Is there any sense you get of networks of writing to one another, sharing strategies, or are they each making this it seems quite an important decision they're making about how to deal with it? Are they making it on a very local basis, but they're all making the same decision?
They're not making the same decisions, and what is important is that is why I spoke of the relocalization of daily life, is that the occupier makes it quite impossible for a mayor to take a train and to go from Antwerp to Liège to ask the Liège mayor what he's doing on the crisis. So communication was very difficult. It was very difficult to get to another place.